Hex perks are one of my favorite parts of Dead by Daylight. They're the very definition of feast or famine in that they can either decide games outright or have absolutely no effect at all. Either way, I think they're absolutely great for the game, and usually they'll fall somewhere between those two extremes, and all things considered, I do think most Hex perks are actually balanced pretty well. They're not all created equally though, and so today what I wanted to do is I wanted to rank every Hex perk in Dead by Daylight from worst to best. There are 14 Hex perks in total at the time of recording, though technically Chucky, the good guy, I think is his DVD name, he is on his way and he's bringing a Hex called 2 Can Play when he drops on November 28th, but I'm not considering that one today because it is very likely to get changed before it actually goes live, and I don't want to rush out a decision on a perk that hasn't even hit the live servers yet. My short answer after looking it over is to say that it looks bad, but we'll see how it performs over the coming weeks, and who knows, maybe it just blows me away and it turns out to be way better than I expected it to, but I don't think it will. Either way, 14 is a decent number to get to, so let's get this rolling and start with number 14, Huntress Lullaby. Now this is a perk that reduces the time between skill check warning sounds and the check itself. If you get this one to all 5 of its tokens, the sound is completely gone, meaning the skill check will just run by without giving you any notification that it's about to start. So this can be very hard on newer players, and it can also be hard on people that are just not necessarily paying attention because, you know, maybe they're watching something on a second monitor, maybe they're talking with friends in Discord, maybe they're distracted because the killer is nearby. So there are times where this one can be useful, especially on the doctor. If doctor is having your skill checks appear all over the screen, that can have some synergy there. But I gotta say, a Hex that can be completely and entirely ignored is just not going to be very good. And this one can be ignored. Experienced players can usually work around Huntress Lullaby without too much of a problem, and when I say experienced players, I don't mean 10,000 hour sweatlords. I'm talking about people who have played the game for a year or so. I think generally speaking, most people, as long as they are paying general attention, they're not going to have a ton of trouble with this perk. So yeah, we are starting off with a not so fantastic perk because, like I said, it works well with Doctor, it works well with certain builds that you can put together, but overall, I would say this one is pretty easily the weakest of the Hex perks, even though that's kind of saying something that even the weakest one still has its place, though this one, I mean, it could probably afford a little bit of a buff, but yeah, overall, it's I'd say just below all right. Next, at number 13, we have Hex Retribution, and this is one where if you are caught, not if you're caught, but if you are cleansing or blessing a totem, it's going to make a survivor oblivious for 45 seconds. In addition to that, the killer sees the auras of all survivors for 15 seconds if the totem that was cleansed or blessed was a Hex. So obviously it's a lot stronger there if you bring this one with other Hex perks, but technically you can bring it on your own. Like if you want to bring it by itself, there's, you know, nobody stopping you. This is a decent little information perk that probably doesn't get enough love, but my main issue is that I'm just not sure that this needs to be a Hex perk at all. I don't know that the risk is greater than the reward here. That the reward may, not actually outweigh the risk because it could get cleansed right away and you're going to get 15 seconds of use. So not necessarily great. I mean, maybe pair it with something like Lethal Pursuer to try to get a couple extra seconds, but even that's probably not worth it. So I don't know. Not awful by any means, but not very good either. I would say that this one is kind of there with Lullaby, where you can see the situations where maybe this would give you some use, but overall you're probably a lot better off taking something else. At number 12, we have Thrill of the Hunt, and this one, the overall effect is actually pretty alright. It gives a 10% slowdown to cleansing and blessing speeds per remaining token, and these tokens are based off of how many totems are left on the map. So that's pretty good. This does make defending hexes a lot easier. Still, there are issues with this one. First is that cleansing bones doesn't take very long anyway, so an added 50% of the time required just really doesn't increase it by much. The second problem is that you ideally aren't spending time hovering around your totems anyway, so you may not get much use out of this one because ideally you're out pursuing people and disrupting their gens and all that. You're not hanging around making sure that your hex totems are all tidy and safe, right? It can come up clutch in a game of inches type of way, but there are definitely better options here. So I'm going to say that this one's clearly better than the two that come before it, but it's also clearly inferior to most everything that's going to come after it. At number 11, I did Hex Face the Darkness, and this is a perk that has a long description if you actually look at it, but the usage is pretty simple. Injure a survivor, and everyone outside of your terror radius will scream. It also reveals their auras for 2 seconds, so, I mean, not bad, right? Not bad as an information perk. As far as information gathering perks go, I think this one's just alright. You know, not great, not terrible, just alright. I would argue that it's more useful on ranged or mobile killers, and it's not bad by any means, but it is admittedly outclassed by other info perks. So if you're trying to get information on where survivors are, I just feel like you've got barbecue and chili that is going to be better for that. Whatever the alien one where you open lockers is going to be better for that. I would even say possibly Spies from the Shadows, which I know doesn't get any love, but possibly better than that. So there are better ones than this, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I do generally like Face the Darkness. I just think it's outclassed. So good perk, definitely not a great perk. Next, we have number 10, Hex Ruin. It's crazy that Ruin is here at all. I mean, if you keep up with kind of the history of the meta in Dead by Daylight, the fact that Hex Ruin would be number 10 on any list is just absolutely crazy. But yeah, so what this one does right now is it regresses generators as if they had just been kicked as soon as they stop being worked on. So it's going to regress at 100% speed, which is the typical speed. Keep in mind, it used to be 250% speed, which was much, much stronger. It does deactivate after a survivor dies by any means, which is a huge con. So yeah, this one used to be the creme de la creme of Dead by Daylight, but these days it's just average. It is painfully average. It would be much better without the deactivation penalty, but oh well, I guess behavior thought that one was necessary. I don't necessarily think it is, but I guess if you have one dead, they're trying to think that maybe you're already winning, which again, I think is a flawed way to look at it, but okay, whatever. They're not going to change it on my, they're not going to change it just because I want it to be changed. So passive slowdown on gens, definitely good, but there are way stronger perks, and Ruin, I think it could use a buff. I think it could, a minor buff, even something like 150% would make it a lot more tempting to bring. Still, if you're going for gen regression, I think that most people know that Eruption and Pop Goes the Weasel and Surge and all that are going to be a lot better for it. But I do think Ruin is, I mean, it's good in that you can slow people's gens down just by chasing them off of them. So that's all right. But because the penalty is so small, you do kind of have to hover around the area or you're not going to get much value out of it. So, you know, we're still in that area. You'll notice I'm saying this about most of these perks. Good, but not necessarily great. Even though I think that's kind of the last one of the maybe good but not great ones. Next, we move on to number 9, which is Hex Haunted Ground, and this one is the one where once you cleanse Haunted Ground, all survivors are exposed for a full minute. That is a full 60 seconds, and it can actually be popped twice if you bring Undying, which I know it's kind of funny to say, okay, well, if you bring this other perk, it does this with this one, you know, because that's not necessarily built into this perk, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it does make it a lot stronger. Haunted Ground is a pretty awesome perk just in general, but it's at its most useful on M1 killers, and it pairs really well with killers like the Clown, who can, you know, he has you exposed and then he can slow you down and get insta downs. Obviously, it's going to be huge that you are aggressive with this one. I think that aggression is the key to getting value out of this one. But the big issue is that you essentially have to demonstrate to the survivors that you have another hex, or they're probably just going to ignore the glowing bones. Because survivors, I would say generally speaking, do know to look for Haunted Ground. And you also have that issue of what if they pop it and they're playing, you know, very immersed and they're stealthing around the map. That can be very, very frustrating. So it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get a whole lot of value out of it, and it may be a complete waste of a perk slot. Ironically, that does mean it pairs pretty well with Retribution, which we mentioned earlier, so that's a pretty solid and kind of old-fashioned little pairing of perks that you can do there. But yeah, like I said, with this one, it's going to help the killers who lack lethality actually have some lethality, and that's very cool. Ironically, it's actually terrible on the nurse, which is awesome, because, you know, obviously she's so busted as is that it's nice to have one where you say, actually, this one's better on the clowns of the world. So yeah, it's cool to see. This one is a cool perk, and I would say it's clearly above everything that's come before it. And you could actually make a case for it being even higher up, but there are too many times where it's just not going to give you the value that you look for out of a hex perk. But still, I would say that in terms of fun factor, it's definitely up there as well. So yeah, I love Haunted Ground, and I'm pretty okay with it being at number 9. Next, at number 8, we have the third seal, and this one is one where both basic attacks and special attacks, so that would include Nurse's Blink, Demo Shred, Nimi's Whip, you know, the Alien's Tail attack, any of that, any of those additional special attacks. Any of these attacks will inflict blindness on survivors, meaning that they cannot see downed survivors or hooked survivors, though I think they do get a brief notification when the hook first takes place, just to give them a chance. I mean, you have to give them some way, especially for solo queue, to know where people are hooked, but after that initial one, they're not going to know where they are. This will also obscure anything related to generator auras, so if it's one of the 2 players who brought something like Felix's Visionary, they're not going to be able to see it. Third seal has always been the redheaded stepchild of Hex Perks, but honestly, I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. This is a perk that stomps solo queue players, and it actually gives most Swifts a hard time too. Sure, if you have a super coordinated team, they can work around it, and I get that that is a legitimate downside of the perk, but honestly, I think that probably 8 out of 10 teams are going to have a very, very hard time with this perk, as long as you do spread the love and actually slap everybody, instead of just like, you know, you have one person blinded, but okay, that's not really going to help you a whole lot. So you do have to be, again, like with so many of these, you have to be aggressive if you want to get value out of it, but there is real value to be had. This one is not overpowered by any means, but I think it's the very definition of a solid perk. Now again, it's a hex, so I may get cleansed. You may not get much out of it, but in my experience, yeah, I get a lot of value out of it. Next, we have number 7, Hex Plaything. Whenever a survivor is hooked while dull totems remain on the map, that survivor is afflicted with obliviousness until they cleanse Plaything. And what's really cool about this one is that for the first 90 seconds, so that's a minute and a half, that Plaything is activated, only the survivor who's been cursed can cleanse it. That means you're not going to have it pop up and their teammate just gets rid of it right away. You're going to get at least a minute 30 out of it unless they go and they find it. Now it does highlight if they get, I think, within something like 12 meters of it, so it's not the hardest thing to find, but you're going to get that value and they're not going to be sitting on a gen, so that's already very useful. This is a very healthy perk that actually encourages survivors to do side objectives without forcing them to, right? This is not the box from the Cenobite. This is one you can ignore it if you choose to, but you probably shouldn't, because having multiple oblivious survivors is highly advantageous for the killer. Though there are certain open maps where, you know, you can kind of see the killer coming from a mile away, and in those cases, it's going to be rather unfortunate for the killer because they're not going to get the drop on you. But you think about something like, okay, you're working in the isolation room on Hawkins and you're oblivious. You better be ready to hop off that gen because you may get grabbed. So very, very rewarding sometimes. And overall, I think it's just the definition of a very, very healthy perk. And I love that so many killers run it. I think it's a cool perk. Obviously, it also pairs well with other hex perks. You can think of something like retribution, or you can think of something like Pento, which we haven't mentioned yet, but we'll get to that one later. It does have that synergy. So overall, Plaything, very, very cool perk. Next, we have Undying, which is a very simple perk in that once you cleanse a hex perk that's not Undying, Undying takes its place. And that means that if they cleanse your Ruin or they cleanse your Devour Hope or something like that, good news, you still have it. Undying takes the bullet for it. It's the secret service for your other hex perks, and that's pretty cool. So this one's good because it negates the greatest weakness inherent to hexes right out of the gate. Because the big downside of hexes is that once they're cleansed, you're done with it. You got no more use out of it. But this one says, okay, well, I'm going to take this first bullet, but next time you're on your own. And that's pretty cool. It also does offer an aura reading aspect where people who walk by totems are revealed to you briefly. I find this to be actually pretty helpful. I get a lot of aura readings out of this, and I don't think people give this one credit for just how useful that is. Yes, the aura reading is infrequent compared to maybe other aura perks, but generally speaking, if you end up getting maybe one down because of it, when that's not even the primary purpose of the perk, that's pretty good. That's something that I consider to be a pretty substantial thing, even if you're not always going to get that value out of it, right? So overall, Undying, it's funny to put it here. I had the hardest time ranking this one out of any of them just because it's like, okay, well, it doesn't really do anything on its own. So you do have to bring another hex perk, but when you bring that other hex perk, it's very nice to have Undying around. So 6, I think 6 is fair. You can make a case maybe for 7 or 8, but I'm okay with putting it at 6. At number 5, we get into the part of the video where you could make a case for really any of these being moved around. 1 to 5 is a very close race. These are all awesome perks. And if you're not using them regularly, I would recommend you at least try each one of these because they're all pretty darn strong. So at number 5, and it's funny because I already feel bad about this one. Like, I made the ranking, I gave it a lot of thought, but I already feel bad about this one because I'm like, man, should this be number 3? Should this be number 1? Like, it's very strong. But at number 5, we have Pento, which is one of the artist perks, and it's wild to me. So this one comes with 5 stacks, and each one's going to have different effects. And the 5th one is just that it blocks off all your totems. They can't cleanse them anymore, so the effects are permanent. It is crazy that one stack is a 30% nerf to gen speeds. That's pretty crazy. After that, you get the 2nd stack, which is going to regress healing. I know the 4th stack is gate opening speed, and I can't remember. I think the 3rd one is how quickly you recover on the ground. So all of these are very, very powerful perks, very powerful benefits, I should say. And really, the downside here is pretty minimal. Really, the downside is that it requires planning. So you do need to go in with a general plan of how you're going to get them to cleanse those bones, because generally speaking, if it's just dull bones, survivors aren't probably going to do a whole lot about it. Just keeping it real, they're not often going to. It's why everybody thinks that Noed is so impossible to deal with, because it's like, what do you want me to do? Cleanse these bones? So really, I would say pair this one with Plaything. Plaything forces their hand a little more. You can pair it with Haunted Ground, something like that. You can try to give them some of the reason. Ruin, it pairs well with other Hex perks, and once they're gone, you actually get more benefit from losing them, which is a cool way to kind of flip the Hexes on their head. You do have to be both patient and a little lucky to get all 5, but don't count on 5. I mean, if you can have 1 stack up at a time, that or 1 token, I don't know if we call them stacks or tokens, but if you have the 1 token, you are regressing Gen's speed by 30%. That's awesome. That is already a very, very serious perk. And it's why I'm really feeling like maybe this should have been higher than number 5, because it's kind of gross, actually. But look, this one's only hurt by the fact that survivors have to cleanse totems, which is why I put it at 5, because it requires the survivors to enable its usage, which that's a weakness. But again, if the survivors have to choose between leaving Devouring Hope and Ruin up or giving you some access to Pento, they're going to give you Pento. So very, very good perk. Next, we have a Trickster perk. This is Hex Crowd Control, and this is the one that blocks off vaults whenever a survivor vaults near you. This is huge. This is huge for in chase, because we all know pallets are nice, but a strong vault is just very, very hard to deal with. So what this one does is it takes out something like the vault at the Killer Shack or at the Ironworks or anything like that, and it makes it where they're going to get a vault at once, but then they're not going to get a vaulted again for the rest of chase, and that's very useful. I think this one really establishes itself as one of the few must cleanse perks for survivors. If they don't cleanse this Hex perk, they're going to suffer. It's going to be a really, really long game for them, and it's very similar to Blood Favor. I had a hard time deciding which would go where, but ultimately I just think that while windows are very, very powerful, and I actually, yeah, it's kind of funny because I mentioned that it's like, oh, well, a good vault is stronger than a good pallet sometimes. Overall, I think that vaults are a little rarer, just in terms of having that power level as compared to something like a God pallet or something. But overall, Crowd Control is an awesome perk. This is one that you should definitely at least give a try if you haven't, because maybe you look at it and it doesn't seem that strong. I would say run it, get back to me. At number 3, I kind of tipped my hand here, and it is Blood Favor. So this one is similar to Crowd Control, but instead of blocking the vaults, it blocks pallets. And this one is just crazy because, firstly, survivors aren't going to know that it's up until you get that first hit. And usually that's going to lead to a pretty easy down, because the survivor is going to be in the area and all of a sudden everything within, I think, 36 meters is blocked off. So they got to get pretty creative pretty quickly, and it's usually not going to work, especially if the killer is at all good in the chase. If it's a killer with the chase power, it just becomes very, very difficult for these survivors to keep it going, and more often than not, they're going to go down pretty quickly. So, like I said though, there is an argument to be made between which is more useful, Blood Favor, Crowd Control. I lean towards Blood Favor, but if you're more in the camp of Crowd Control, I get that, and I think they're both awesome perks. I don't know that I would necessarily advise running them together, but it would be funny. So if you do that, let me know how it goes. I'd be curious to know if there's a lot of success with that, because at least, that way they can't vault and they can't throw pallets. What can they do? I guess cry, probably, and then go cleanse the totems. But if I'm the survivor, I'm just gonna assume the fetal position and cry, because I'm doomed, right? And that's a pretty strong perk. And that's not a great position to be in. Next, at number 2, we have Hex No One Escapes Death. Of course, everybody calls this one Noed, and this is the one where after the final gen is popped, you gain a speed boost and you can insta-down survivors. Now, this one, I already hear it, yes, sure, it is technically counterable, but as already mentioned earlier, that really doesn't happen a whole lot. The odds of all 5 totems being cleansed before the end of the game is just very, very low. It does not happen a lot. Because it's funny, the better teams, the stronger survivors, tend to not focus on anything but gens. They're going to hammer out gens as quickly as possible, and that can backfire. That can absolutely backfire. And the real strength of this one, I think, is that not just that you get the insta-downs, which is awesome, but you get the insta-downs and a speed boost. That is... Gosh, that's 2 powerful effects, and you're getting them both. I would almost say that maybe it would be better if that was 2 separate perks, but it's probably too late for that. It's probably not going to happen, but anyway, it's still a very strong perk, even after all the nerfs. Survivor mains, I have a theory, and I'm a Survivor main these days, right? I like playing Survivor more than Killer. It's less stressful, so... I have a theory about Survivor mains. I think they only say that it's dead, it being Noed, because they don't want you to use it. I think it's very telling that it gets more salt than just about any killer perk in the game, because people feel like it's not fair and all that, and that's an argument for another day. But for whatever reason, I think it's funny that you'll hear people say, oh yeah, it's dead. Nobody uses Noed anymore. No, it's still pretty strong. It's actually still pretty good. And for whatever reason, it is just like actual crack for like Wraith mains. So if you ever face a Wraith, just assume it's time to start cleansing some bones. But yeah, very, very strong perk. Makes a real case for number 1. But I didn't put it there because at number 1, I put Hex Devour Hope. The beauty of this perk is that survivors won't know it's in play until it's too late, until you get that first insta-down. And by the way, if you play around with injured people, they won't actually know until you get the 5th stack, which is crazy. I mean, not super likely, but it is technically possible, especially, I guess, if you're playing on, a killer who can M2 or something like that. But yeah, so this one is really strong as is, and now that now that totems are hidden better, it is fairly typical to at least get 1 free down out of this perk. And again, as a clown main, I'm just going to tell you again, an insta down is huge for killers that already struggle to get the downs, because somebody like the Nurse or the Blight doesn't need this. But if you're one of the weaker killers, or by the way, a strong killer like somebody like the Spirit, you're gonna get a lot of value out of this. And like so many of these, this is another perk where aggression makes all the difference. So you're going to want to go out and pursue, you're going to want to go out and try to dominate as much as you can. And hopefully you get to watch the really cool Mori animations as a result of all that. And much like Plaything, this one is also very healthy in that it encourages side objectives while discouraging camping. So Plaything doesn't have anything to do with the camping, but it's the side objectives, right? But yeah, this one also discourages camping because you have to be away from the hook and you get a speed boost when you leave the hook. So overall, I mean, what is there to say about Devour Hope? It is one of the coolest and most effective perks in the game. It's crazy that they hit it out of the park so immediately with one of their Hex perk concepts, because this one came out with the Hag, who of course introduced Hex perks. And overall, this is one that I really enjoy bringing on the regular. It gives me a lot of value, and I hope I'll see more people using it because I don't feel like I see that many Devour Hopes. Now, I am curious to know what everybody else thinks about all of these perks. Which ones did I get right? Which ones did I get wrong? Let me know in the comments below. Keep in mind, I do have a Twitch, DOS_food. Go hop over to that one. I want to start streaming more. We'll see if that works out. But either way, I thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, I have been DOS_food. Bye, friends.
I've been dreaming on in my head like I've seen it. A life worth living is a life with meaning. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my